Hey guys, in this tutorial we are going to look into box selection. I believe after this point you know how to do tab selection. So let's begin. Now at the end of assignment 5, all of you should have these files: selection manager, entity manager, oriented physics, control manager. Now till now you have done tab selection. So here in the update function, this code checks whether the tab key is pressed or not, and if tab key is pressed, then select next entity function is called, which selects an entity, and then you can give command to that particular selected entity. Now in this tutorial we will be focusing on box selection. That means multiple entity selection. For the box selection, let's go back to our update function. I have written these lines of code, and I'll explain everything line by line. But before looking into the code, let's understand how box selection works. Now let's say that there are multiple entities and you want to select 3 of them at the same time. In the tab selection, you select this one, assuming this is index 0, and then you select this one, assuming this is index 1, and so on. But with the box selection, we can select these 3 together. What we do in box selection, we click somewhere, let's say zoom here, and then we drag our mouse from there to here. So this is position 1 where you click, and this is position 2. From position 1 to position 2, you drag your mouse. What this does essentially, now you have this box, and then you iterate over the list of entities you have, which is this, 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 in this case 4, and for each entity you see whether the position of this entity lies inside this box or not. So if the entity position lies inside this box, that entity will be selected. If the entity lies outside the box, that entity will not be selected. So this is the main concept of box selection. Let's go to the code. Here, what this line of code is doing, we are checking whether the mouse is pressed or not, left button is pressed or not. If it is pressed, then we say it's selecting true. It's selecting is a global bool variable that I have defined here in the selection manager script. This is a global bool variable. It's selecting. That means we tell that okay, we are doing box selection, and then we save the position of mouse click. This is mouse position 1. This is a 3D vector here, vector 3 mouse position 1, and I save the value of mouse position that I get from input dot mouse position. So what is this mouse position 1? this mouse position 1 is this position 1, this position. From the left side we clicked and we dragged till this point. So this is mouse position 1, the left, and this will be the right position. Now I save this value. Again I check here in this line that mouse is still pressed. That means we pressed and we are dragging now. What we will do? We will next go over list of entities that we have. I'll come to this selected IDs. I'll come to this later. Now this is the list of entities that we have. It's exactly not the list of entities, but this is a list of entity 381. It's very similar to that you had entity 381 in Ogre. So entity 381 is a class where you define all the variables associated with a game object, an entity, in this case ships. So for example, velocity, position, speed, desired speed, heading, desired heading, all these values you associated with the each entity. Now these entity manager dot ints dot entities, this is a list of entity 381. So I iterate over the list of entity 381 and then check whether the position of the entity lies in the bound or not. What is this bound? This bound is this. This bound is this. Now I need to calculate this bound accurately. Then I can calculate whether these three lies inside the bound or not. Now when we check here that this function is within selection bounds and I provide one input argument which is position of the entity, this function is here. What this function does, it checks first, are we doing box selection? If you are not doing box selection, then there is no point. But let's say we are doing box selection, then this won't return false. This will go to a next. Here, let's look at this. Get viewport bounds. Get viewport bound is a function that I have defined in utils. You guys should have utils by now. In utils, you can define some function that you need a lot for the calculation purpose. So here, get viewport bound is a function defined in utils, and that takes three arguments. First argument is the camera, the main camera. Second argument is mouse position 1. Remember the mouse position 1 is here. That is the first time you click the mouse on the left side. Here. This position. And the third argument it takes is current mouse position, input.mouse position, which is here, position 2. With these three input argument, this function get viewport bound returns the boundaries. Now let's look at this function. This function is defined in utils here. This will return bounds. So this takes left mouse position, right mouse position, calculate vector 3 min max and return this bound. Now going back to selection manager. Once we have the bound, then we will check whether this position lies inside the bound or not. So viewport bounds has an internal function that called contains. Viewport bounds dot contains, that take one argument. Camera dot world to viewport point position. That means we are checking here whether this lies inside the bound or not. Once we say, okay, we have an entity inside the bound, this will return true. And if this returns true, that means here this is true, we will go inside this if statement. Now, the selected IDs, what is the selected IDs? Earlier in the tab selection, at any given time, only one entity is selected. And then you can select a new entity by pressing tab. Now, in the box selection, we can have multiple entities selected. We don't have one. We can have one, but we can have more than one. Now, for this purpose, I have declared a list here of type int selected IDs, and in this I am going to store the ID of selected entities. That means in this example I have 3 entities within the bound, so the selected IDs, this should have 3 elements, and those are what will be those elements? Those elements will be the ID associated with the entity. Now for that, let's go to entity 381. You all should have entity 381. In the entity 381, I added one more variable called public int ID. So every entity, every ship will have a unique ID, and I will access this ID and save it here in the selected IDs. That is exactly what is happening here. Once I know that this entity position is inside the bound, I'm going to push the ID of that particular entity into selected IDs. Now at the end, this will give me a list of entities that is selected, and I can give a single command to all those selected entities to move or to rotate, to whatever operation you want. Now in the update function, these lines do the box selection. Now let's say that at the end of this update function, I have a list of IDs associated with the entities, right? Now I want to iterate over this selected IDs and start giving the commands. Okay, now let's go to control manager script file, which is here, control manager.cs. In the control manager.cs, here I'm iterating over the list of selected IDs and giving command to move or to rotate on one particular selected entity. Now prior to this, in the tab selection, you had only one entity selected at any given time, and you were calculating that particular index like this: select next entity, selected entity index. Now with the tab, you are keeping track of this index, selected entity index, and with the help of this index you were looking at selected entity of type 381 here. Once you get selected entity index, from entity manager dot inst dot entities and the index, you get a selected entity. On this selected entity, you perform all the operations. Now in the box selection, I don't have one entity selected, I have a list of entity selected. Now to perform operations on all those selected entity, I am iterating over this. This is a slightly change from the assignment 5. In the assignment 5, you directly perform operation on a selected entity, but here I have to find all those entities that are selected. So inside this for loop, I have selected entity of type entity 381. This I get it like this: entity manager dot inst dot entities, and this is the index. And this index I am getting from that list of selected entity, that is selected IDs. From here I can get different entities that is in the inside the box and perform the operation. Right now I have to show that a particular entity or more than one entity is selected. So there has to be some way to show that at this given time that these entities are selected. There are many ways to do that. In this tutorial I am going to talk about how we can show. To show that a particular entity is selected, I am going to draw a circle around that entity. And to draw a circle, first I am going to create some points. This create point function generates point around entity, and then draw lines between those points. This function takes some arguments such as x position of the entity, z position of the entity, radius, and a color. Now if we go through this function, this is a simple function. What this does is this creates 10 point and draw a line between those 10 points, those adjacent 10 points, to create a circle. Now there are other ways as well. This is just one way to do. Now what will happen? Suppose I have selected 3 entities. I have 3 entities inside the bound, and I am performing the same operation on all those 3 selected entities. So what should happen when I give command? All 3 entities should start moving, or all 3 entities should start rotating together with just single command. We can verify this when we play. Now let's go back to selection manager. Suppose we started with the box selection, but after some time we want to go back to the tab selection. We may need to give an individual command to particular game object or to particular ship. That means we have to do box selection. To do the box selection, we just press tab and go to the selected entities. Here we find the selected entity index, and whatever the selected IDs we had earlier from the box selection, we clear that and add a new index which is selected entity index. That means even with the tab selection we still have list of entities, but that list of entity, that means selected IDs, will have only one element, and that element is selected entity index. Now when we have only one element and we go to control manager, this I less than selection manager dot inst dot selected id dot count, this will be 1. So we will be performing all the operation on only one entity that we selected with tab. Right now, after tab selection, once we go back to the box selection, what will happen? Let's see. After tab selection, once we go back to the box selection, first we find that we are doing box selection, then we say okay, we are pressing the mouse button and dragging it. We clear the selected IDs list. Whatever the entity was selected previously, we clear that, and then we'll iterate over the list of entities and push all the entity lists that we find within the bound, within the rectangle bound. Right. So this way we can switch between box selection and tab selection back and forth. Now to show everything, to show a box on the screen, what we will do, we will call this GUI function. This on GUI, this is an inbuilt Unity function. Here we will call three functions defined in utils just to just to create a rectangle, to see a rectangle when we play and when we do box selection. So the first function is get a screen rect. That means that get a screen rectangle that takes two argument, mouse position 1, that means a left click, and the mouse position, that means the right mouse position, which is position 1 and position 2. So this is mouse position 1 and this is input dot mouse position, that means the current mouse position. What this will do, this will give us a rectangle, this will give us a bound, this will give us this bound. Next, utils dot draw a screen rect. That means we will draw the four sides, top, bottom, left and right sides of that rectangle, and we will draw the borders and inside both. So if we go to these functions, this is here, screen position 1, screen position 2, this will return as a rect, that means a bound, and then we will start drawing the boundaries. So draw a screen border, which is defined here. Draw a screen rectangle, and then here we can define the color. For example, color is this. Draw texture. Texture is white texture. I have defined some textures here. This here, and this texture I have given color white. You can give it any color you like. Let's say you can give it red color. Let's go back to selection manager. This on GUI function will show us a box in red color, and if we find an entities inside those box, here we will get the list of, here we will get the IDs of all those entities, and with this ID in the control manager, when we iterate over selected IDs.count, we will give simultaneous command to all the selected entities. Okay, so let's go back to the Unity editor, and okay, before going forward, in the editor, when we see movable entities, we have two, DDG51 and tugboat, right? And when we see managers in the entity manager, here we have entities, size is 2, element 0 in DDG51, element 1 tugboat, right? Now remember that in the entity 381 I had added one variable called ID, int ID. That means I'm going to assign ID to different IDs to different entities. So let's look at this DDG51. Here the ID is 0, that I assigned this ID as 0. Tugboat, I assign the ID as 1, right? Okay, now let's hit play. Okay, let's click here and drag. We see this red box, red boundaries, and leave here. Now you can see that there is two entity inside the bound selected, and you can see a red circle around the entity. Here in the console, if you see, this prints 0 DDG51, that means the index and the name of the entity at that index, 1 index and the name is tugboat. Now These two entities are selected. If I give for forward move command, both entities should start moving together. Let's give this command, press page up, so we can see both entities are start moving, and then let's turn left. Now see that both entities are turning left. Now let's deselect all, click somewhere else. Now let's press tab. See this tugboat is selected. Now previously tugboat was moving left, now let's move it right. Only tugboat. Now see this tugboat is moving right. Let's press tab again to select DDG51 and move that to right as well. Now let's see. Now DDG51 is also moving to right. Now let's do box selection again and rotate both of them to the left. So this way we can do box selection or tab selection back and forth and give individual or simultaneous command to multiple entities. Okay, so that's all for this tutorial. Thank you.